Hello, you're listening to Seraphim. Today I bring you another original story about hidden fortunes, broken pride, and karma that never forgets. The congregation of Grace Eternal Baptist Church fell silent when First Lady Vanessa Caldwell pointed her manicured finger at the widow in the third pew and called her a Jezebel, a snake, a home-wrecking temptress who had been slithering into her husband's bed for months. 60-year-old Dorothy Mae Jenkins, a woman who had scrubbed the church floors every Saturday for 11 years without asking for a single dollar, stood up slowly, clutched her purse to her chest, and walked out the front door without saying one word. What nobody in that sanctuary knew, not the deacons frozen in their seats, not the choir members clutching their hymnals, not the 347 members who watched Dorothy leave with her head bowed, was that Dorothy Mae Jenkins had never touched Pastor Gregory Caldwell in her life. She was protecting his 15-year-old daughter, and the accusation was designed to destroy the only person the girl had ever trusted enough to tell the truth. But let me start from the beginning, because this story does not begin with a lie told in a church. It begins with a glass of sweet tea on a Tuesday afternoon, and a girl who showed up at a screen door with bruises she said came from volleyball practice. Dorothy Mae Jenkins lived in a pale yellow house on Canker Street, the last paved road before the neighborhood turned to gravel and mud. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and dish soap no matter the season. The porch leaned slightly to the left, and the screen door had a tear in it that Dorothy kept meaning to patch but never did. She had lived there for 37 years, first with her husband Earl, then alone after Earl passed from a stroke in the produce aisle of a Piggly Wiggly, and now with her 2 grandchildren, Marcus and Lily, whose mother had disappeared into a life Dorothy did not like to talk about. Marcus was 12, a quiet boy with serious eyes who read books about space and kept a notebook full of drawings of rockets. Lily was 9, a firecracker who talked to everyone and everything, including the stray cats that gathered on the porch at dusk. Dorothy raised them on a monthly Social Security check that came to $1,142, supplemented by what she earned cleaning houses 3 days a week. Tuesday, she cleaned for the Pattersons on Oak Hill Drive. Thursday, she cleaned for Mrs. Whitfield, a retired schoolteacher who always left a plate of cookies on the counter. Saturday, she cleaned the church, which paid nothing but filled her soul in a way she could not explain to anyone who did not already understand. Her morning started at 5:15, before the children woke. She would sit at the kitchen table in the dark, with a cup of coffee so strong it could strip paint, and she would read her Bible by the light of a small lamp with a cracked shade. She read slowly, moving her finger along the words, not because she could not read well, but because she believed the words deserved patience. She whispered the verses to herself, her lips moving in the blue darkness, and sometimes she spoke to Earl as if he were sitting across from her. "Earl, you hear that? The Lord says He will make a way where there is no way. I believe it. I still believe it." By 6, she was making oatmeal for the children, packing lunches in brown paper bags, laying out their school clothes on the backs of kitchen chairs. Marcus liked his shirts buttoned to the top. Lily liked mismatched socks. Dorothy obliged both preferences without comment. She walked them to the bus stop at the corner of Canker and Vine, waited until the bus swallowed them up, and then she walked back home to begin her day. The walk was 8 minutes each way. She had counted once, years ago, and never counted again. The church was the center of her life outside that yellow house. Grace Eternal Baptist sat on a wide lot at the intersection of Martin Luther King Boulevard and 7th Street, a handsome brick building with a white steeple and stained glass windows that threw colored light across the pews on Sunday mornings. Pastor Gregory Caldwell had led the congregation for 14 years. He was a tall man, 6'3", with a deep voice that could make scripture sound like thunder rolling across a valley. He wore tailored suits in charcoal and navy. His shoes were always polished. His smile was wide and warm, and when he shook your hand, he held it a beat longer than necessary, looked you in the eyes, and said your name like it mattered. The congregation loved him. They loved his sermons about grace and redemption. They loved the way he quoted James Baldwin alongside the Apostle Paul. They loved his wife Vanessa, who sat in the front pew every Sunday in a different hat, each one more elaborate than the last, and who organized the annual women's luncheon and the Christmas toy drive and the Easter egg hunt for the children. They loved their daughter, Hope, a slender girl with her father's height and her mother's sharp cheekbones, who sang in the youth choir and made the honor roll every semester. From the outside, the Caldwell family looked like a portrait of grace, the kind of family you pointed to and said, "See, that is what the Lord can build." Dorothy had known Gregory Caldwell since he was a young associate pastor, fresh out of seminary, before he married Vanessa, before Hope was born. She remembered him as eager, humble, a little nervous. He used to stammer during his first sermons, and Dorothy would nod encouragingly from her seat, silently willing him forward. Over the years, she watched him grow into his authority. She watched his voice deepen, his shoulders straighten, his confidence expand until it filled every corner of the sanctuary. She was proud of him, the way a grandmother is proud of a child she helped raise, even though she had no official claim to that role. She was simply a woman who had been there from the start. Vanessa Caldwell was a different matter. Dorothy did not dislike Vanessa, but she did not understand her either. Vanessa was beautiful in a way that seemed to require constant maintenance, always at the salon, always shopping, always redecorating the parsonage. She drove a pearl-white Cadillac Escalade that she parked in the handicap spot outside the church entrance because, as she explained to anyone who asked, she had a bad knee. The bad knee never seemed to bother her in heels. Vanessa was the kind of woman who smiled at you while her eyes measured you, calculated your worth, and filed you away in a category you would never know about. Dorothy had watched Vanessa freeze out other women in the church over the years. Sister Thomas, who had dared to compliment Pastor Caldwell's sermon a little too enthusiastically. Sister Monroe, who had brought a casserole to the parsonage when the pastor was sick and made the mistake of staying to chat. Each time, the woman would find herself gradually excluded from committees, overlooked for volunteer positions, whispered about in the parking lot after service. Vanessa never raised her voice. She never made a scene. She simply rearranged the social architecture of the church until the offending woman found herself standing outside of it, wondering what had happened. Dorothy saw all of this and said nothing, because Dorothy believed that the Lord would sort things out in His own time, and because she was 60 years old and had learned that some battles were not hers to fight. That belief held steady until the Tuesday afternoon in September when Hope Caldwell appeared at Dorothy's screen door. Dorothy was in the kitchen, washing collard greens in the sink, listening to Mahalia Jackson on a radio so old the antenna was held together with aluminum foil and prayer. She heard the knock, soft, almost reluctant, and dried her hands on her apron as she walked to the front of the house. Through the screen, she saw Hope standing on the porch, her backpack hanging from one shoulder, her school uniform wrinkled, her eyes red. "Baby, what are you doing here?" Dorothy said, pushing the screen door open. Come in. You look like you've been running. Sit down. Let me get you some water." Hope stepped inside but did not sit. She stood in the small living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw clenched. She was 15, but in that moment she looked both older and younger than her years. Older in her eyes, which carried a weight Dorothy recognized but could not yet name. Younger in the way she stood, pulled inward, trying to make herself small. "Miss Dorothy," Hope said, and her voice cracked on the second syllable. She pressed her lips together, swallowed hard, and tried again. "Miss Dorothy, I need to tell you something, but you have to promise me you will not tell my mama." Dorothy set the glass of water on the coffee table and eased herself into the armchair across from the girl. The radio in the kitchen was still playing. Mahalia was singing about crossing over Jordan. The afternoon light came through the window and landed on the worn carpet in a golden rectangle. Dorothy folded her hands in her lap and looked at Hope the way she had looked at hundreds of children over the years, with patience, with stillness, with the kind of attention that says, "I am not going anywhere. I am not in the business of making promises I do not understand yet," Dorothy said gently, "but I am in the business of listening. So you go ahead and talk, and we will figure out the rest together." Hope's chin trembled. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard that Dorothy could see the muscles in her jaw working. Then the girl sat down on the edge of the sofa, set her backpack on the floor between her feet, and pulled up the left sleeve of her uniform blouse. 3 bruises ran along her forearm, dark purple fading to yellow at the edges, each one roughly the size of a man's thumb. They were not the kind of bruises you got from bumping into a doorframe. They were the kind that came from being gripped, hard, by someone who wanted to hold you in place. "I told Mama they were from volleyball," Hope said quietly, staring at the bruises as if they belonged to someone else. "She believed me. She always believes whatever is easiest to believe." Dorothy felt something shift inside her chest. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like a door opening onto a room she had always suspected was there, but had never been willing to enter. She looked at the bruises on Hope's arm, and then she looked at Hope's face, and she saw the fear there, the shame, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would understand what she was saying without making her spell it out in words that would burn her mouth on the way out. "Who did this to you?" Dorothy asked. Her voice was steady, her hands were steady, but under the surface, something was beginning to shake. Hope looked at the floor. She looked at the wall. She looked at the glass of water on the coffee table. She looked everywhere except at Dorothy's eyes. The silence stretched out between them, thick and heavy, filled with the sound of Mahalia Jackson and the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. "My daddy," Hope whispered. And then she broke. The tears came in a rush, silent at first, then loud, then silent again, her shoulders heaving, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt. Dorothy moved from the armchair to the sofa, slowly, carefully, the way you approach a wounded animal. She sat beside Hope and put one arm around the girl's shoulders, and Hope turned into her and pressed her face against Dorothy's collarbone and sobbed with the kind of abandon that only comes when you have been holding something inside for so long that your body cannot contain it anymore. Dorothy held her. She did not ask more questions. She did not gasp. She did not say, "Are you sure?" or "Maybe you misunderstood," or any of the other things that adults say when they want the truth to be something other than what it is. She simply held the girl and let her cry, and she stared over Hope's shaking head at the wall where a framed photo of Earl smiled back at her, and she felt the room tilt beneath her like the floor of a ship in a storm. When Hope's sobs finally slowed to hiccups and shudders, Dorothy reached for the glass of water and held it to the girl's lips. Hope drank, her hands still trembling. A droplet rolled down her chin, and Dorothy caught it with the hem of her apron. They sat together in the fading afternoon light, and Dorothy waited because she knew there was more. There was always more. "It started last year," Hope said, her voice raw and scraped. "After I turned 14. He said it was because I was growing up and he needed to teach me things. He said other fathers do it too, but they just do not talk about it. He said if I told anyone, they would not believe me because he is the pastor, and everyone loves him, and who would believe a teenage girl over a man of God?" Dorothy's fingers tightened around the arm of the sofa. She could feel the rough fabric under her nails. She could feel the texture of every thread. She focused on that sensation because if she did not focus on something physical and immediate, she was going to stand up and walk to that parsonage and do something that would land her in a cell for the rest of her natural life. "He comes into my room at night," Hope continued, each word falling like a stone into still water. "He waits until Mama takes her sleeping pills. She takes them every night because she says she has anxiety. He waits until the house is quiet, and then he opens my door. He does not knock. He never knocks. I hear the handle turn, and I know. I always know. I pretend to be asleep, but it does not matter. He does what he does, and then he leaves, and in the morning, he makes pancakes and asks me about school like nothing happened." Dorothy closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she saw the sanctuary of Grace Eternal Baptist, the stained glass, the polished pews, the pulpit where Gregory Caldwell stood every Sunday and spoke about the love of God. She saw his smile, his tailored suits, his polished shoes. She saw the way people looked at him, with admiration, with trust, with something close to reverence. And she felt a fury so clean and sharp that it took her breath away. "I believe you," Dorothy said. 3 words. She said them clearly, without hesitation, without qualification. She opened her eyes and looked directly into Hope's. "I believe you, baby." Every word. And we are going to get you help. I promise you that. Hope's face crumpled again, but this time the tears were different. They were tears of relief, the kind that come when a weight you have been carrying alone for a year is suddenly shared with another pair of shoulders. She grabbed Dorothy's hand and held it so tight that both their knuckles went white. "You cannot tell my mama," Hope said urgently. "Please, Miss Dorothy, she will not believe me. She will say I am lying. She will say I am trying to ruin her life. You do not know how she is. She loves him more than she loves me. She has always loved him more than she loves me. If you tell her, she will make it go away, and then it will be worse for me. It will be so much worse." Dorothy looked at this child, this beautiful, terrified child, and she knew that Hope was right. She had watched Vanessa Caldwell for 14 years. She knew exactly what Vanessa would do. Vanessa would not believe her daughter. Vanessa would protect her husband, her image, her position. Vanessa would sacrifice her own child on the altar of respectability before she would let the truth bring down the kingdom she had built. "I am not going to tell your mama," Dorothy said carefully, "but we cannot let this keep happening. There are people whose job it is to protect children. There are laws. There are places you can go where you will be safe." "He will destroy you," Hope said, and the certainty in her voice was chilling. "If he finds out I told you, he will destroy you. He has done it before. There was a woman at the church, Sister Hayes, who used to watch me sometimes. I think she saw something, or maybe she suspected. One day she was gone. My father told the congregation she had been stealing from the church fund. Nobody questioned it. Nobody even asked for proof. She just disappeared." Dorothy remembered Sister Hayes, a kind woman with a loud laugh who used to bring homemade fudge to the bake sales. One Sunday she was there, and the next she was not, and Pastor Caldwell had stood at the pulpit and spoken sorrowfully about the sin of theft and the importance of trust, and the congregation had shaken their heads and moved on. Dorothy had thought it was strange at the time. She had thought it was very strange, but she had said nothing because she was 60 years old and she had learned that some battles were not hers to fight. Except now, sitting on this sofa with this girl's hand in hers, she understood that she had been wrong. Some battles choose you, and when they do, you do not get to walk away. "Listen to me," Dorothy said, and her voice had changed. It was no longer the soft, grandmotherly voice she used with the children at church. It was the voice she had used 40 years ago when a man tried to shortchange her at the register, and she looked him dead in the eye and said, "Count it again." It was the voice of a woman who had survived things that would have broken people twice her size. "I am not Sister Hayes. I have been in this church longer than your father has been alive. I have nothing to lose and everything to gain by doing what is right. Nobody is going to destroy me. Do you understand?" Hope looked at her with wide eyes. She nodded slowly, but Dorothy could see the doubt there, the fear that had been planted so deep it had become part of the girl's foundation. Breaking that fear would take time. They did not have time, but they had this moment, and Dorothy intended to use it. "Here is what we are going to do," Dorothy said. "You are going to come to my house after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We will tell your parents you are helping me with a project for the church. That part is even true, because you will be helping me fold bulletins and organize the supply closet. While you are here, you are safe. Nobody walks into my house without my permission. And I am going to make some phone calls to people who know how to handle situations like this. We are going to build a case, baby, brick by brick, and when the time comes, nobody will be able to deny what happened to you." Hope stared at her for a long moment. Then she reached for the glass of water and took another sip, and Dorothy noticed that her hands had stopped shaking. Not completely, but enough. The girl set the glass down and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and took a breath so deep that her shoulders rose and fell like a wave. "Okay," Hope said. "Okay, Miss Dorothy, I trust you." Dorothy squeezed the girl's hand one more time, then released it and stood up. She walked to the kitchen, turned off the radio, and stood at the sink, staring at the collard greens in the water. The leaves floated on the surface, dark green and still. Her reflection stared back at her from the window above the sink, and she barely recognized herself. She looked older. She looked harder. She looked like a woman who had just stepped onto a road she could not turn back from. She picked up the phone on the kitchen wall, a landline she refused to give up because she did not trust things that needed charging. And she dialed the number of her old friend, Ruth Ann Carter. Ruth Ann had been a social worker for 30 years before she retired. She lived on the other side of town in a house full of rescue cats and true crime novels. She answered on the second ring. "Ruth Ann?" Dorothy said quietly, glancing toward the living room where Hope was sitting. "I need your help. I need you to tell me what to do when a child tells you something that nobody wants to hear." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Ruth Ann said, "Dorothy, is this about what I think it is about?" "Yes." Another pause. Then, "Come to my house tomorrow. Bring a notebook. And Dorothy, whatever you do, do not confront the parents. Not yet. The moment they know someone else knows, they will close ranks. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Dorothy said. She hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the silence. The collard greens floated in the sink. The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. She thought about Earl, about what he would say if he were here. She thought about her grandchildren, about what she would want someone to do if Marcus or Lily ever came to a stranger's door with bruises on their arms. She turned from the sink, walked back to the living room, and sat down next to Hope. The girl had stopped crying. She was sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. Dorothy put her hand on the girl's knee. "You are going to be all right," Dorothy said. "I know it does not feel that way right now, but I have been on this earth a long time, and I have seen the Lord move in ways that make no sense until later. You came to the right door, baby. You came to the right door." Hope nodded. She did not speak, but she leaned her head against Dorothy's shoulder, and they sat together in the small living room as the afternoon light shifted from gold to amber to the soft gray of early evening. And Dorothy Jenkins made a decision in that gray light that would cost her nearly everything she had, and eventually give her back more than she ever imagined. The weeks that followed were a careful, terrifying dance. Dorothy went to Ruth Ann's house the next day, as promised, and sat at her kitchen table surrounded by cats and coffee cups, while Ruth Ann walked her through the process. Ruth Ann was blunt, as she had always been. She explained mandated reporting. She explained what would happen when a report was filed. She explained the likelihood that Gregory Caldwell would deny everything. She explained what kinds of evidence would be needed, what a forensic interview looked like, what the legal system could and could not do. She explained all of this in a flat, professional tone that she had developed over 30 years of dealing with the worst things human beings could do to each other. "The hardest part," Ruth Ann said, leaning forward and looking Dorothy dead in the eyes, "is that the system does not always work. You know that. Sometimes the abuser walks. Sometimes the child is not believed. Sometimes the family closes ranks and the child recants because they are terrified. You need to be prepared for every outcome, including the worst one." "I am prepared," Dorothy said, but her coffee had gone cold in her hands, and she realized she had been gripping the mug so tightly that her fingers ached when she set it down. Ruth Ann noticed. She reached across the table and covered Dorothy's hands with her own. "You are doing the right thing," Ruth Ann said softly. "But doing the right thing has never been the same as doing the easy thing. You know that better than most." Dorothy nodded. She pulled a small notebook from her purse, the kind with a cardboard cover and lined pages, and she wrote down everything Ruth Ann told her. She wrote down phone numbers, organizations, websites, legal terms. She wrote in her careful, rounded handwriting, pressing hard enough that the pen left indentations on the pages beneath. When she was done, she tucked the notebook back in her purse, thanked Ruth Ann, and drove home in her 20-year-old Buick with the windows down, because the air conditioning had stopped working in 2019, and she had never gotten around to fixing it. Hope came to Dorothy's house that first Tuesday as planned. They sat at the kitchen table and folded church bulletins while Marcus and Lily did homework in the living room. To anyone watching, it was exactly what it appeared to be, a church lady and a church girl doing church work. But between the folds and creases, Hope talked. She talked about her father, about the first time it happened, about how he had come into her room on a Thursday night when her mother was at a women's retreat in Atlanta. She talked about the way he smelled, like the cologne he wore to Sunday service, the one the congregation had given him for his birthday, and how she could not smell that cologne anymore without feeling like she was going to vomit. She talked about lying in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling, counting the bumps in the plaster because if she counted high enough, she could pretend she was somewhere else. Dorothy listened. She did not interrupt. She did not react in the ways her body wanted to react. The flinching, the gasping, the urge to weep and rage and break things. She kept her face calm and her hands busy and her voice steady, because that was what Hope needed. Hope did not need another person falling apart. She needed someone who could hold the weight without crumbling under it. But at night, after the children were in bed and the house was dark, Dorothy sat in the kitchen alone and let herself feel it. The rage came first, hot and consuming, a fire that started in her chest and spread outward until her whole body burned with it. Then the grief, cold and heavy, settling in her bones like water seeping into the foundation of an old house. Then the fear, sharp and electric, the knowledge that she was a 60-year-old woman on a fixed income going up against a man who controlled a congregation of 300 people, a man who had the community's trust, the deacon's loyalty, and his wife's blind devotion. She sat in the dark kitchen and looked at the photo of Earl on the refrigerator, held there by a magnet shaped like a peach that Lily had bought at a dollar store. Earl smiled back at her from behind the glossy surface, wearing the fishing hat he loved, squinting against the sun. "I could use you right about now, Earl," she whispered. "I could really use you right about now." The silence of the house answered her. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Outside, a dog barked twice and then was quiet. Dorothy finished her cold coffee, rinsed the mug, set it upside down on the drain board, and went to bed. She slept for 2 hours. She dreamed about a door opening in the dark, and she woke with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The Tuesdays and Thursdays became a rhythm. Hope came after school, stayed for 2 hours, helped with whatever small task Dorothy invented, and talked. Each visit peeled back another layer. Dorothy learned that the abuse had started with touching and progressed to something worse. She learned that Hope had tried to tell her mother once, obliquely, testing the waters with a hypothetical question about a friend at school whose father was too touchy. Vanessa had looked up from her phone, said, "Some girls exaggerate for attention," and gone back to scrolling through Instagram. Hope never tried again. Dorothy also learned that she and Hope were being watched. Not deliberately, not with any suspicion, but in the casual, gossipy way that church communities monitor their members. Sister Florence Henderson, who lived 2 blocks from Dorothy and missed nothing, mentioned to Vanessa during a prayer circle that she had seen the pastor's daughter going into Dorothy's house twice that week. Vanessa's eyes had narrowed just for a second before the smile returned. That was the first warning sign. Dorothy felt it the way you feel a change in the weather, a drop in pressure, a coolness on the wind. She mentioned it to Hope, and the girl's face went white. "She is watching," Hope said, her voice tight. "She always watches. She does not know what she is looking for yet, but she is looking." Dorothy nodded slowly. She was standing at the kitchen counter, slicing an apple into wedges for the children. The knife moved through the fruit with a crisp sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. She set the knife down and wiped her hands on her apron, the same apron she had been wearing the day Hope first appeared at her door. "Then we need to be more careful," Dorothy said, "and we need to move faster." She called Ruth Ann that evening. They spoke for 40 minutes. Ruth Ann had been making inquiries of her own, reaching out to contacts at Child Protective Services, to a prosecutor she knew from her working days, to a therapist who specialized in forensic interviews with minors. The wheels were turning, slowly but turning. Ruth Ann said that the most important thing was to get Hope into a forensic interview where her testimony could be documented by a professional. Once that was done, the case would have a foundation. Without it, everything was hearsay. "The problem," Ruth Ann said, "is that you cannot get a minor into a forensic interview without parental consent unless CPS has already opened an investigation. And CPS will not open an investigation without a report. And the moment a report is filed, the parents are notified. And the moment the parents are notified, Gregory Caldwell will know that someone talked, and he will come for whoever that someone is. Dorothy sat in her kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, and she looked at the notebook she had filled with Ruth Ann's instructions. She looked at the page where she had written the words "forensic interview" and underlined them twice. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9:14 in the evening. Marcus and Lily were asleep. The house was silent except for the eternal hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the main road.
"Then we file the report," Dorothy said, "and we deal with what comes."
"Dorothy," Ruth Ann said, and there was something in her voice that Dorothy had never heard before. It was not fear, exactly. It was respect mixed with worry. "You understand what this means. He will not just deny it. He will come after you. He will use the church. He will use the community. He will use every weapon he has. And his biggest weapon is his reputation, yours against his. A poor church volunteer against the pastor. You know how that plays out." "I know," Dorothy said. "I have known since the first day, but that girl has nobody else, and I am not afraid of Gregory Caldwell. I have been afraid of bigger things than him. I was afraid when Earl died, and I did not know how I was going to feed my grandchildren. I was afraid when Marcus had pneumonia, and I sat in that hospital for 3 days praying to God to let him live. I survived those fears. I will survive this one." Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right, I will set it up. We file on Monday. And Dorothy, keep that notebook somewhere safe, not in your house, somewhere he would never think to look." Dorothy hung up the phone. She sat at the table for a long time. Then she stood, took the notebook from her purse, wrapped it in a plastic bag, and walked outside into the warm September night. She went to the far corner of her backyard, where Earl's old tool shed stood, rusted and leaning, and she put the notebook inside a coffee can on the top shelf behind a row of empty paint cans. She closed the shed door, looked up at the stars, and said, "All right, Lord, I am stepping out on faith. You better catch me." The weekend before the report was to be filed, everything changed. Dorothy was at the church on Saturday, doing her usual cleaning, sweeping the fellowship hall, wiping down the pews, dusting the pulpit. She was alone in the building, or so she thought. She was on her knees in the sanctuary, cleaning the base of the communion table with a rag and a spray bottle of vinegar water, when she heard voices coming from the hallway that led to the pastor's study. She froze. The voices were muffled by the closed door, but she could make out 2 of them. One was Gregory Caldwell. The other was Vanessa. They were arguing. Dorothy could not hear the words, but the rhythm was unmistakable. The sharp staccato of accusation, the low rumble of defense, the rising pitch of anger. She stayed on her knees, barely breathing. She had no business listening to other people's private conversations. But something held her there, a feeling in her gut that said this mattered. The door to the pastor's study opened. Dorothy heard footsteps coming down the hallway toward the sanctuary. She quickly began scrubbing the communion table again, her head down, her movements brisk and natural. Vanessa Caldwell walked into the sanctuary, her heels clicking on the tile, and stopped when she saw Dorothy. "Oh," Vanessa said. Her voice was bright and hard, like a light bulb about to blow. "Dorothy, I did not know you were still here." "Just finishing up, First Lady," Dorothy said, not looking up from her work. She could feel Vanessa's eyes on her like a physical pressure, like someone pressing a thumb between her shoulder blades. "I will be out of your way in just a minute." Vanessa did not move. She stood there, her arms crossed, her designer handbag hooked over one elbow, and she watched Dorothy clean. The silence between them was loaded, full of unspoken things. Then Vanessa spoke, and her voice had changed. The brightness was gone. In its place was something cold and smooth, like a river stone. "Dorothy, has my daughter been spending time at your house?" Dorothy's hand stopped moving on the communion table. Just for a second. Then she resumed scrubbing, keeping her rhythm steady, keeping her voice even. "Hope has been helping me with some church projects, First Lady. Folding bulletins, organizing the supply closet. She is a good girl, very helpful." Vanessa said. It was not a word. It was a sound that contained measurement and judgment and the beginning of a plan. "I think that is going to stop." Dorothy looked up for the first time. Vanessa was standing in the center aisle, the colored light from the stained glass windows falling across her face in patches of red and blue and gold. She looked beautiful and frightening, like something you might see in a fever dream. Her eyes were fixed on Dorothy with an intensity that made the air between them feel thin and difficult to breathe.
Hope needs to focus on her studies, Vanessa said smoothly. She has been distracted lately. Her grades are slipping. I am sure you understand.
Of course, First Lady, Dorothy said. Whatever you think is best. Vanessa stared at her for another long moment. Then she turned on her heel and walked back down the hallway. Dorothy heard the click of the pastor's study door closing. She heard the voices resume, lower this time, more urgent. She knelt there on the floor of the sanctuary, her rag in her hand, her knees aching against the hard tile, and she understood with perfect clarity what was happening. Vanessa suspected something. She did not know what, but she was pulling hope away from the only safe person the girl had, and she was doing it with the efficiency and ruthlessness of a woman who had been protecting her position for 14 years. Dorothy finished her cleaning in a daze. She locked the church, walked to her car, and sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes before she could make herself turn the key. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white and the skin stretched tight over the bones, and she whispered through clenched teeth, "You will not have that child. You will not have her." She drove straight to Ruth Ann's house. Ruth Ann was in her garden, wearing a floppy hat and muddy gloves, pulling weeds from around her tomato plants. She took one look at Dorothy's face, stripped off her gloves and said, "Inside, now." They sat at the kitchen table. 3 cats circled their feet. Dorothy told Ruth Ann everything. The argument she had overheard, Vanessa's visit to the sanctuary, the cold precision of her words. Ruth Ann listened without interrupting, her face growing tighter and harder with each sentence.
We file tomorrow, Ruth Ann said when Dorothy finished.
Not Monday, tomorrow. I will call Patricia Green at CPS tonight. She owes me a favor. We get the report in, we get it documented, and then whatever Vanessa Caldwell does, there is a paper trail.
And Hope? Dorothy asked.
If they pull her away from me, if they isolate her, she has nobody.
Ruth Ann reached across the table and took Dorothy's hand.
Dorothy, listen to me. Once the report is filed, things are going to move fast. CPS will contact the family. Gregory Caldwell will deny everything. Vanessa will back him up. The church will close ranks, and they will come for you. You need to be ready. Is there anyone in the congregation you trust? Truly trust. Not the kind of trust where you share recipes, the kind of trust where you share secrets. Dorothy thought about it. She thought about the 347 members of Grace Eternal Baptist Church. She thought about the deacons, the choir, the women's ministry, the youth group leaders. She thought about who among them would stand up to Gregory Caldwell, who would risk their position, their friendships, their place in the community. The list was short, painfully short. Deacon James Washington, she said slowly. He and Earl were friends. He has never liked how the finances are handled, but he keeps quiet because he does not want trouble. And Sister Althea Collins. She teaches the children's Sunday school. She has a good heart, and she does not care what anybody thinks of her.
Call them, Ruth Ann said.
Not tonight. After the report is filed. When the storm starts, you are going to need people in that church who know the truth. Because Gregory Caldwell's first move will be to turn the congregation against you. He will make you the villain. He will make you the story. And if you are standing alone, he will win.
Dorothy nodded.
She stood up, thanked Ruth Ann, and drove home. The sun was going down. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the kind of sunset that Earl used to call a painter's sky. She pulled into her driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence. Through the kitchen window, she could see Marcus and Lily at the table, doing homework, their heads bent over their papers. The lamp cast a warm circle of light around them. They looked safe. They looked loved. They looked like everything that mattered in the world. She got out of the car, walked inside, kissed each grandchild on the top of their head, and started making dinner. She made meatloaf and mashed potatoes and green beans, Earl's favorite meal. And she set the table with the good plates, the ones with the blue flowers that her mother-in-law had given her as a wedding gift. Marcus looked at the good plates and raised his eyebrows. "Special occasion, Grandma?" he asked. "Every dinner with you two is a special occasion," Dorothy said, and she meant it with her whole heart. That night, after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and stared at the phone on the wall. She thought about calling Hope, but she did not have the girl's cell phone number, and calling the parsonage was out of the question. She thought about driving over there, but that would be even worse. She was cut off. Vanessa had severed the connection with surgical precision, and Dorothy had no way to reach Hope without raising the alarm. She picked up the phone and called Ruth Ann one more time. "File it tomorrow morning," she said, "first thing, before they have time to do anything else." "It is already done," Ruth Ann said. "I called Patricia 30 minutes ago. She is filing the report tonight. An investigator will be assigned by morning." Dorothy closed her eyes. She leaned her forehead against the cool wall next to the phone and breathed. In and out. In and out. The chamomile tea sat untouched on the table, its steam rising in a thin curl that disappeared into the darkness above the lamp. "Thank you, Ruth Ann," she said. "Do not thank me yet," Ruth Ann replied. "The hard part has not even started." Ruth Ann was right. The hard part started 48 hours later on Monday morning, when CPS investigator Claudia Freeman arrived at the parsonage in a county car and knocked on the front door. Dorothy was not there. She did not see what happened, but she heard about it later from multiple sources in bits and pieces that she assembled like a puzzle with jagged edges. Gregory Caldwell answered the door in his bathrobe. Claudia Freeman introduced herself, showed her badge, and explained that she was there regarding a report of suspected child abuse. She needed to speak with Hope Caldwell alone. Gregory's face went through several transformations in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and then something else, something darker, a flash of raw panic that he covered so quickly with righteous indignation that most people would have missed it. But Claudia Freeman had been doing this job for 12 years, and she did not miss it. "This is absurd," Gregory said, his deep voice filling the doorway. "There must be some kind of mistake. My daughter is perfectly fine. She is upstairs getting ready for school. Who filed this report?" "I am not able to disclose that information, Pastor Caldwell," Claudia said evenly. "I need to speak with your daughter. It is standard procedure." Vanessa appeared behind Gregory, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair in a satin bonnet. She looked at Claudia Freeman with the same measuring gaze she used on everyone. "What is this about?" she demanded. Claudia repeated herself. Vanessa's eyes went wide, then narrow, then wide again. She looked at Gregory. Gregory looked at her. And in that silent exchange, something passed between them, a communication that was faster and more complex than words. It was the look of two people who have built something together and are watching the first crack appear in the foundation. "Of course you can speak with Hope," Vanessa said, her voice suddenly cooperative, warm, concerned. "We have nothing to hide. Gregory, go wake her up. Tell her someone from the county wants to talk to her." Claudia Freeman spoke with Hope in the living room for 20 minutes, while Gregory and Vanessa waited in the kitchen. What Hope said in those 20 minutes, Dorothy would not learn until much later. What Dorothy did learn that same afternoon was that Claudia Freeman left the parsonage looking troubled, that she made 3 phone calls from her car before driving away, and that by evening, Gregory Caldwell knew that someone in his congregation had reported him. The retaliation began the very next day. Dorothy was at home, folding laundry in the living room, when her phone rang. It was Deacon Harold Price, the head deacon, a man who had always been cordial to her, but who she had never fully trusted because he had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Sister Dorothy," Deacon Price said, and his voice had a formal quality that immediately put Dorothy on alert. "The Pastoral Council has asked me to inform you that your volunteer services at Grace Eternal are no longer needed. We appreciate your years of dedication, but we are restructuring our volunteer program and moving in a different direction." Dorothy stood in her living room with a pillowcase in one hand and the phone in the other. She looked at the laundry basket, at the small shirts and the small socks and the small underwear that belonged to her grandchildren. She looked at the photo of Earl on the mantel. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. May I ask who made this decision, Deacon Price? It was a collective decision by the pastoral council, he said smoothly. Too smoothly. I see, Dorothy said. And does this have anything to do with the fact that a CPS investigator visited the parsonage yesterday? The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It lasted 3 full seconds. Then Deacon Price said, I do not know what you are talking about, Sister Dorothy. This is simply about restructuring. I hope you understand. God bless you. He hung up. Dorothy set the phone down on the coffee table and sat on the edge of the sofa. The pillowcase was still in her hand. She smoothed it over her knee, folding it into a neat rectangle, pressing the creases flat with her palm. Her movements were slow and deliberate, the movements of a woman who was keeping herself together by focusing on the smallest possible task. She knew what was coming. She had known since the moment she sat at Ruth Ann's kitchen table. But knowing a storm is coming and standing in the rain are two different things. The storm broke on Sunday. Dorothy almost did not go to church that morning. She stood in front of her closet at 6:30, looking at her dresses, the navy blue one she wore to funerals, the pale green one she wore to Easter, the cream-colored one she wore most Sundays because it was comfortable and because Earl had once told her she looked like an angel in it. She reached for the cream dress, then stopped. She pulled out the navy blue one instead. It felt more appropriate. She was going to a funeral of sorts, the funeral of her reputation. She dressed the children, fed them breakfast, and drove to Grace Eternal Baptist Church. The parking lot was full, the sun was bright, the stained glass windows glowed. Everything looked the same as it had every Sunday for the past 11 years. But when Dorothy walked through the front doors, holding Marcus and Lily by the hand, something shifted. She felt it before she saw it, a change in the atmosphere, like the moment before a thunderclap. Eyes turned toward her, conversations paused. Smiles that were usually offered freely became tight and uncertain. She walked to her usual seat in the third pew on the left side, the seat she had occupied since before Gregory Caldwell became pastor, and she sat down with her grandchildren on either side of her. Marcus opened his Bible. Lily swung her feet, which did not yet reach the floor. Dorothy folded her hands in her lap and waited. The choir sang. The deacons took the offering. Sister Johnson read the announcements. Everything followed the familiar script, and for a moment, Dorothy allowed herself to hope that maybe it would not happen today. Maybe Vanessa would wait. Maybe they would handle this quietly, privately, away from the sanctuary. Then Pastor Gregory Caldwell stepped to the pulpit. He was wearing a charcoal suit with a silver tie. His shoes gleamed. His Bible was open in his hand. He looked out over the congregation with the same warm, commanding gaze he always used, and he began to preach about the devil's work in the church. He preached about wolves in sheep's clothing. He preached about lies and temptation and the destruction that comes when evil creeps into sacred spaces. His voice rose and fell like music, powerful and persuasive, and the congregation responded with amens and hallelujahs, feeding the rhythm, building the energy. Dorothy sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her jaw was tight. She knew where this was going. She could see it coming the way you see a car heading for you on a dark road. Headlights growing brighter, engine growing louder, and there is nothing to do but brace. And then Vanessa Caldwell stood up. She stood up from the front pew, turned to face the congregation, and she was crying. Perfect tears rolling down her perfect cheeks, catching the light from the stained glass windows. She was wearing a white dress, pristine and symbolic, and her hat was small and tasteful and perched on her head at an angle that conveyed both elegance and vulnerability. She looked like a woman in pain. She looked like a woman who had been wronged. She looked like exactly what she wanted to look like. "Church family," Vanessa said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I have prayed about whether to say this. I have fasted. I have wept. But the Lord has told me that the truth must come to light, even when it hurts. Even when it tears at the fabric of our beloved community." The congregation went silent. 347 pairs of eyes fixed on Vanessa Caldwell. Dorothy felt Marcus tense beside her. She put her hand on his knee, a small, steady pressure that said, "Stay still. Do not react. I am here." "There is a woman in this church," Vanessa continued, her voice gaining strength even as the tears continued to flow. who has been pursuing my husband, a woman we all trusted, a woman who smiled in our faces every Sunday while she plotted to destroy our family. She used her position as a volunteer to get close to my husband. She used the church itself as her hunting ground. And when my husband rejected her advances, when he told her firmly and lovingly that he was a married man of God, she retaliated. She filed a false report with Child Protective Services, accusing my husband of unspeakable things, trying to destroy his reputation, his ministry, and his family. A gasp rippled through the sanctuary. Heads turned, eyes searched. Dorothy could feel them landing on her, one by one, like drops of rain before a downpour. She sat absolutely still. She did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She looked straight ahead at the pulpit, at the cross that hung above it, at the stained glass window behind it, where Jesus held a lamb in his arms. Vanessa raised her hand and pointed. Her manicured finger, tipped in burgundy nail polish, extended across the sanctuary like a weapon. It pointed directly at Dorothy Mae Jenkins, sitting in the third pew on the left side, flanked by her grandchildren. "That woman," Vanessa said, "is Dorothy Jenkins." The sanctuary erupted, not with sound, at first, but with movement. Heads snapping toward Dorothy, mouths opening, hands reaching for other hands. The energy in the room shifted from worship to spectacle, from sacred to savage, and Dorothy sat in the center of it like a stone in a river, letting the current crash around her. "I am asking the deacons," Vanessa said, her voice now sharp and commanding, "to remove this woman from our sanctuary. She is no longer welcome in this house of God. She has violated the sanctity of our family, our ministry, and our church. She is a Jezebel and a liar, and I will not sit in the same room with her for one more second." Two deacons rose from their seats. Harold Price was one of them. The other was Deacon Curtis Webb, a large, quiet man who looked deeply uncomfortable. They approached Dorothy's pew, and Dorothy watched them come with the calm, measuring eyes of a woman who has already made her peace with what is about to happen. Marcus was gripping his Bible so hard, the cover was bending. His young face was set in an expression of fierce confusion, caught between fear and the instinct to protect his grandmother. Lily was pressed against Dorothy's side, her small hand clutching the fabric of Dorothy's dress. Dorothy could feel the child trembling. "Sister Dorothy," Deacon Price said, standing at the end of the pew, his voice low but audible to everyone in the quiet sanctuary. "Would you please come with us?" Dorothy looked at him. She looked at Deacon Webb. She looked at the congregation watching her with a mix of shock, curiosity, pity, and in some faces, satisfaction. She looked at Vanessa, standing at the front, a portrait of righteous indignation. She looked at Gregory Caldwell behind the pulpit, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who stood there with his Bible in his hand, and an expression on his face that Dorothy could not read. And then she looked at Hope. The girl was sitting in the front pew, the seat her mother had vacated. She was perfectly still. Her face was blank, the kind of blank that is not calm but catastrophically controlled. The face of a child who is watching the only person who believed her being destroyed and who cannot do a single thing about it. Hope's hands were in her lap, her fingers intertwined, and Dorothy could see from across the sanctuary that her knuckles were white. Dorothy stood. She picked up her purse. She took Marcus by one hand and Lily by the other. She did not speak. She did not defend herself. She did not look at Vanessa or Gregory. She walked down the aisle of Grace Eternal Baptist Church, the aisle she had walked every Sunday for 11 years, past the pews where she had sat with Earl, past the spot where she had knelt and prayed after he died, past the communion table she had cleaned on her knees just the week before. She walked with her head up and her back straight and her grandchildren beside her, and she did not look back. The door of the church closed behind them. The sunlight hit her face. The parking lot was hot and bright, and the cicadas were screaming in the trees. Lily was crying softly. Marcus was not crying, but his jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in his young face stood out like cords. "Grandma," Marcus said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Why did she say those things? Why did she lie?" Dorothy knelt down on the hot asphalt of the parking lot, right there between the cars, and she gathered both children in her arms. She held them close, her cheek against Marcus's head, her hand on Lily's back, and she breathed in the scent of them, laundry detergent and childhood, and everything precious in the world. Sometimes, Dorothy said, people tell lies to keep the truth from coming out. And sometimes the people who get hurt the worst are the ones who are trying to do the right thing. But I need you to hear me. I did not do what that woman said. I would never do anything like that. And one day, the truth will come out. The truth always comes out. It may take a while, but it never stays buried. You understand me? Marcus nodded. Lily pressed her face harder against Dorothy's shoulder. Dorothy stood up, her knees aching from the asphalt, and she led her grandchildren to the car. She buckled them in, got behind the wheel, and drove home. She did not cry. She drove with both hands on the wheel, her eyes on the road, her jaw set. She drove past the houses of people who would hear about this by evening. She drove past the grocery store where people would whisper when they saw her. She drove past the park where she took the children on Saturday mornings, where other church families gathered, where she would no longer be welcome. She parked in the driveway of her pale yellow house on Canker Street. She went inside. She made lunch. She washed the dishes. She helped Marcus with his math homework. She braided Lily's hair. She did all of these things with the steady, mechanical precision of a woman who is holding herself together through the sheer force of routine. Because if she stops moving, if she lets herself think about what just happened, she will shatter. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat in the kitchen and she shattered. She wept, not quietly, not gracefully. She wept with her face in her hands and her shoulders heaving, and her voice making sounds that were not words but raw expressions of pain and fury and helplessness. She wept for Hope, who was trapped in that house with a monster and a mother who chose blindness over truth. She wept for herself, for the reputation she had built over 60 years of decent, honest living. A reputation that had been demolished in 60 seconds by a woman in a white dress with rehearsed tears. She wept for Earl, who was not there to put his arm around her and say, "We will figure this out, Dot. We always do." She wept until there was nothing left. Then she washed her face at the kitchen sink, dried it on a dish towel, and picked up the phone. She called Ruth Ann. "It happened," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "They accused me in front of the whole church, said I was after the pastor, said I filed the report out of revenge. They threw me out." Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment. Then she said a word that Dorothy did not normally approve of, but that, in this case, felt entirely appropriate. "We expected this," Ruth Ann continued. "This is exactly what abusers do. They get ahead of the story. They make the whistleblower the villain. They use the community as a weapon. Dorothy, this is not over. This is just the beginning. How is the CPS investigation going?" "I do not know," Dorothy said. "They have not told me anything. I filed the report. That is all I can do." "No," Ruth Ann said firmly. "That is not all you can do. You said there were people in that church you trusted. Deacon Washington, Sister Collins. Call them. Tell them the truth. Not everything, not about Hope, but enough so they know you are not what Vanessa Caldwell says you are. You need allies, Dorothy. You cannot fight this alone." Dorothy called Deacon James Washington the next morning. James was 72 years old, a retired postal worker with a bad hip and a good heart. He and Earl had been friends since childhood. They had fished together, played cards together, argued about baseball together. When Earl died, James was the first person at Dorothy's door, carrying a casserole and a bottle of bourbon and saying, "The casserole is from my wife. The bourbon is from me. You look like you need both." James answered the phone on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for her call. "I saw what happened yesterday," he said before Dorothy could speak. "I saw it, and I was ashamed. Ashamed of myself for sitting there and not saying a word. Ashamed of every deacon who stood up and followed orders. Dorothy, what in the world is going on?" Dorothy took a deep breath. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her coffee in front of her, the morning sun coming through the window and falling on her hands. She looked at her hands, at the lines and creases and calluses that map 60 years of living, and she chose her words with great care. "James, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What I am about to tell you cannot leave this conversation. Not yet. But you need to know the truth, because the truth is going to come out. And when it does, there are going to be people in that church who need to be on the right side," she told him. "Not everything." She did not tell him the specific details of what Hope had revealed, because those were not her details to share. But she told him enough. She told him that a child in the church was being hurt by someone the congregation trusted, and that the accusation against her was a smokescreen designed to discredit the one person the child had told. She told him that CPS was investigating. She told him that the truth was documented and that it would eventually come to light. James was silent for a long time. Dorothy could hear him breathing. She could hear the tick of the clock on his wall, the same clock that had been there when she and Earl used to visit for dinner parties 20 years ago. Then James spoke, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "I did not know what, but I knew. There has been something wrong in that church for years, Dorothy. The money does not add up. The way he handles things, always behind closed doors, always through Vanessa, always with that smile that never quite reaches his eyes. I have seen it. I have just been too much of a coward to say anything." "You are not a coward, James," Dorothy said. "You are a man who was not sure. Now you are sure. And now I need you to do something for me. I need you to be my eyes and ears in that church. I need you to watch and listen. And when the time comes, I need you to stand up." "I will," James said. "Earl would never forgive me if I did not." Dorothy hung up the phone and allowed herself one small moment of relief. It was not much. It was a candle in a hurricane, but it was light and she would take it. She called Sister Althea Collins next. Althea was 55, a retired nurse who had moved to the area 5 years ago after her divorce. She taught the children's Sunday school class with a combination of fierce love and strict discipline that made her simultaneously the most popular and most feared adult in the building under the age of 60. She had no ties to the old power structure of the church. She owed nobody anything. And she had the kind of moral backbone that Dorothy had always admired. "I wondered when you would call," Althea said. "I watched that spectacle yesterday and my blood was boiling. I have seen women like Vanessa Caldwell my whole life. Women who build their identity around a man and then burn down anyone who threatens that. Dorothy, I do not believe a word of what she said. Not one syllable." "Thank you, Althea," Dorothy said, and her voice cracked for the first time. She caught herself, pressed her lips together, and continued. "I need your help. Can you come to my house this evening? There are things I need to tell you." "I will be there at 7, Althea said. "And I am bringing dinner. You sound like a woman who has not been eating." Althea came at 7, carrying a pan of baked chicken, a bowl of rice, and a bag of dinner rolls. She also brought her laptop and a legal pad and a pen, because Althea was the kind of woman who came prepared. They sat at Dorothy's kitchen table after Marcus and Lily were in bed, and Dorothy told her what she had told James, the broad strokes, the shape of the truth without the most painful details. Althea listened with the focused intensity of a woman who had spent 30 years assessing patients. She did not interrupt. She did not react with shock or horror. She asked questions, precise and careful questions, and she wrote things down on the legal pad in her neat, angular handwriting. When Dorothy finished, Althea set down her pen, crossed her arms, and leaned back in her chair. Her face was hard. Not angry, resolved. "Here is what concerns me," Althea said. "The CPS investigation is important, but it is slow. It could take weeks, months. In the meantime, Gregory Caldwell controls the narrative. He has 300 people believing you are a homewrecker. He has the deacons in his pocket. He has Vanessa performing the role of the wronged wife. And he has Hope isolated, with no one to turn to. Am I understanding the situation correctly?" "You are," Dorothy said. "Then we need to speed things up," Althea said. "We need evidence that does not depend on a 15-year-old girl's word against her father's. Because as much as I believe you, and I do believe you, a court is going to need more than belief. A court is going to need proof." Dorothy thought about this. She thought about the notebook in the coffee can in Earl's shed, filled with Ruth Ann's instructions and Hope's words. She thought about the bruises she had seen on Hope's arm, which had faded by now. She thought about the CPS investigator, Claudia Freeman, who had gone to the parsonage and spoken to Hope, but who had not told Dorothy anything about what was said or what would happen next. "There is something else," Dorothy said slowly. "Something I have not told you yet." The girl mentioned a woman named Sister Hayes. She said Hayes was pushed out of the church years ago because she might have suspected something. Gregory told the congregation she was stealing from the church fund. Nobody questioned it. Althea's eyes narrowed. "Do you know where Sister Hayes is now?" "No, but I know someone who might. Ruth Ann Carter. She has been helping me with this from the beginning." "Call her," Althea said. "If we can find Sister Hayes, and if she corroborates any of this, it establishes a pattern. One accuser can be dismissed, two cannot, especially when the accused is the one who drove them both out." Dorothy called Ruth Ann right there at the kitchen table, with Althea listening. Ruth Ann answered, and Dorothy put her on speaker. Within 10 minutes, they had a plan. Ruth Ann would track down Sister Hayes. Althea would quietly gather information within the church, talking to women she trusted, listening for anyone else who had noticed something wrong. Dorothy would continue to cooperate with CPS and wait for the investigation to proceed. And all three of them would document everything. "One more thing," Ruth Ann said over the speaker. "Dorothy, I need you to be very careful. Do not engage with Vanessa or Gregory. Do not respond to anything they say about you in the church. Do not post on social media. Do not talk to the press. Say nothing. Do nothing. Let them think they have won, because the moment they relax, that is when they make mistakes." "I have been quiet my whole life," Dorothy said. "I can be quiet a little longer." They hung up. Althea gathered her things, paused at the door, and looked back at Dorothy. "You know," Althea said, "when I moved to this town, I did not know a soul. I walked into that church because I needed somewhere to belong. You were the first person who spoke to me. You introduced yourself, asked me about my life, invited me to the women's Bible study. You did not know me from Adam. You just saw a stranger and decided to be kind." Dorothy shrugged. "That is what you do. You see a stranger, you be kind." "Exactly," Althea said. "And that is how I know you are not what Vanessa Caldwell says you are. A woman who extends kindness to strangers does not do the things she accused you of. It is not in the architecture of who you are." After Althea left, Dorothy sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. She looked at the photo of Earl on the refrigerator, held in place by the peach magnet. She looked at the cracked lamp on the kitchen table. She looked at the phone on the wall. She looked at her own hands, folded on the table in front of her, still and steady. "Architecture," she repeated quietly. "I like that word." Then she got up, washed the dinner dishes, checked on the children, and went to bed. She slept for 4 hours, better than the night before. Not good, but better. Progress measured in minutes of rest. The next 2 weeks were a siege. Word of the Sunday spectacle spread through the community like a brush fire. People who had known Dorothy for decades suddenly crossed the street when they saw her coming. The woman at the grocery store, who usually chatted with her about the weather while scanning her items, became efficient and silent. Parents at Marcus and Lily's school gave her wide berth at pickup, clustering in groups that fell quiet when she approached. A note appeared in her mailbox, unsigned, written in block letters on lined paper. "Jezebels burn in hell." Dorothy kept the note. She put it in a plastic bag and added it to the coffee can in Earl's shed. Alongside the notebook and a growing collection of documents, text messages printed from Althea's phone, screenshots of social media posts from church members calling Dorothy a homewrecker, a copy of the CPS report, notes from every conversation she had with Ruth Ann. The coffee can was getting full. Dorothy bought a second one. Marcus came home from school one afternoon with a split lip. He would not tell Dorothy what happened, but she could see from the mud on his shirt and the rage in his eyes that someone had said something about his grandmother, and Marcus had responded the only way a 12-year-old boy who loves his grandmother knows how. Dorothy cleaned his lip, put ice on it, and sat him down at the kitchen table. "Marcus, I need you to listen to me. I know this is hard. I know people are saying things, but you cannot fight them, not with your fists. That is not how we win this." "Then how?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to be a man when he was still just a boy. "How do we win this, Grandma? Because from where I am sitting, we are losing. You lost your church. People are saying horrible things about you. Lily cries every night because she misses Sunday school. How do we win?" Dorothy looked at her grandson. She looked at his split lip and his angry eyes and his clenched fists, and she saw Earl in him, the same fierce protectiveness, the same refusal to accept injustice. She reached across the table and took his hands. "We win by being patient," she said. "We win by telling the truth and letting the truth do its work. I know it does not feel like it right now. I know it feels like the bad people are winning. But they are not winning, baby. They are just louder. The truth is quiet, but it is strong. It outlasts everything. You remember that story I used to tell you about the oak tree and the storm?" Marcus nodded reluctantly. "The storm roars and howls and breaks branches, but the oak stands. Not because it roars back, because its roots go deep. Our roots go deep, Marcus. We are not going anywhere." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he unclenched his fists and said, "Okay, Grandma, okay." But she could see that he was not fully convinced. He was 12. 12-year-olds need justice to arrive on schedule, not at the Lord's mysterious pace. Meanwhile, Ruth Ann had found Sister Hayes. Her real name was Gloria Hayes, and she was living in a town 40 miles away, working as a receptionist at a dental office. Ruth Ann drove out to see her on a Wednesday afternoon and came back with information that made the situation both more hopeful and more terrifying. Gloria Hayes confirmed everything. She had been a volunteer at Grace Eternal for 6 years. She worked with the youth group. She had noticed that Pastor Caldwell paid unusual attention to certain girls in the congregation, always the quiet ones, always the ones from difficult family situations. She had seen him touch a girl's shoulder in a way that lingered too long. She had heard him invite a teenager to his study for counseling and close the door. She had raised her concerns privately to one of the deacons. 2 weeks later, Gregory Caldwell announced to the congregation that Gloria Hayes had been caught embezzling from the church fund. There was no investigation. No evidence was presented. Gloria was simply erased. "I could have fought it," Gloria told Ruth Ann, sitting in the break room of the dental office with a cup of coffee she never drank. "But I was scared. He had the whole church behind him. Who was going to believe me? A single woman with no family in town, against the pastor? I left because staying would have killed me. I have spent 3 years trying to forgive myself for leaving those girls behind." Ruth Ann asked Gloria if she would be willing to make a statement to CPS. Gloria was quiet for a long time. Then she said yes. Ruth Ann drove back to Dorothy's house that evening, and the three of them, Dorothy, Ruth Ann, and Althea, sat at the kitchen table and looked at the evidence they had assembled. Dorothy's notebook with Hope's disclosures. Gloria Hayes' corroborating statement. Screenshots of the church's retaliatory campaign against Dorothy. The unsigned threat in the mailbox. Althea's careful notes from conversations with other women in the church who had, once pressed, admitted to their own moments of unease around the pastor. "It is not enough for a conviction," Ruth Ann said honestly, "but it is enough for CPS to escalate the investigation, and it is enough for a judge to order a forensic interview, which does not require parental consent when there is sufficient evidence of risk." "Then we give it to them," Dorothy said. "All of it." The next morning, Dorothy drove to the county offices and met with Claudia Freeman. She brought everything: the notebook, Gloria's statement, the documentation. Claudia Freeman spread the materials across her desk and read each document carefully, her face unreadable. When she finished, she looked up at Dorothy with an expression that was part admiration and part sorrow. "You have done more than most people would do in your position, Mrs. Jenkins," Claudia said. "I want you to know that. This is significant material. I am going to recommend an escalated investigation, and I am going to push for a forensic interview with Hope." "How long?" Dorothy asked. "I cannot give you a timeline. The system moves slowly. But I can tell you that this file is no longer sitting at the bottom of a stack. It is at the top." Dorothy nodded. She thanked Claudia Freeman. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat and gripped the wheel. The sun was coming through the windshield, warm on her face, and she closed her eyes and let it wash over her. For the first time in weeks, the knot in her chest loosened just a fraction. Not much, just enough. But Vanessa Caldwell was not finished. The following Sunday, which Dorothy did not attend, Vanessa stood before the congregation again. This time, she was not crying, she was smiling. The kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. She announced that the church's legal team was considering a defamation lawsuit against Dorothy Mae Jenkins for her false and malicious CPS report. She announced that Dorothy's cleaning contract with the church was being reviewed for financial irregularities. She announced that any member of the congregation who was found to be in contact with Dorothy would be asked to explain themselves before the pastoral council. The message was clear. Support Dorothy, and you are next. Althea Collins heard about this from a woman in the choir who called her in tears. I like Dorothy, the woman said. I have always liked her. But I have my children in the youth group, and my husband is on the building committee, and I cannot afford to lose my place in this church. I am sorry, Althea. I am so sorry. Althea called Dorothy. They are tightening the net. She threatened a lawsuit and financial investigation. People are scared. Dorothy was standing in her kitchen washing dishes. The water was too hot. She could feel it turning her hands red. She did not turn it down. Let them be scared, Dorothy said. Fear is temporary. The truth is permanent. But she was scared too. She was scared about the lawsuit. She was scared about the financial accusation, even though she had never taken a penny from that church. She was scared about her grandchildren who were suffering for a fight they did not understand. She was scared about Hope, trapped in that house, alone, watching the one person who believed her being systematically destroyed. That night she could not sleep at all. She sat in the kitchen with the light off, staring at the darkness outside the window. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. The peach magnet held Earl's photo to the door. She stared at his face and whispered, I am so tired, Earl. I am so tired. Tell me I am doing the right thing. The silence did not answer. It never did. But she felt something, a warmth in her chest, a steadiness in her spine, and she chose to interpret it as Earl's hand on her shoulder, and she chose to go on. 3 days later, the forensic interview happened. Claudia Freeman had moved fast, faster than anyone expected. A judge reviewed the evidence, including Gloria Hayes' statement, and ordered that Hope Caldwell be interviewed by a trained forensic specialist at the Child Advocacy Center, a separate facility designed for exactly this kind of interview, quiet, private, recorded. The interview was conducted without Gregory or Vanessa present, which was their legal right to oppose, but which, on the advice of their attorney, they chose not to contest. Fighting the interview would have made them look guilty. Cooperating made them look innocent. It was a calculation, not a capitulation. Dorothy was not told what Hope said in the interview, but she was told by Claudia Freeman in a brief phone call that evening that the investigation was being escalated to law enforcement. That meant that what Hope had described was serious enough to warrant criminal charges. That meant the police would be involved. That meant Gregory Caldwell's nightmare, the one he had built an entire machine of lies and intimidation to prevent, was about to come true. Dorothy hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the clock. It was 7:18 in the evening. Marcus was in his room reading a book about the solar system. Lily was on the floor of the living room coloring a picture of a horse. The house was quiet and warm and safe, and Dorothy let herself feel, for the first time in weeks, something that she had been afraid to feel, because she thought it would make her soft. Hope. Then the doorbell rang. Dorothy got up and walked to the front door. Through the peephole, she saw a figure on the porch, illuminated by the yellow glow of the porch light. It was Hope Caldwell. She was standing with a backpack over one shoulder and a duffel bag in her hand, and her face was swollen on the left side, the eye half closed, the cheek darkening to purple. Dorothy opened the door so fast the screen door banged against the railing. She pulled Hope inside, locked the door behind her, and guided the girl to the sofa. Lily looked up from her coloring with wide eyes. Marcus appeared in the hallway, his book still in his hand, and stopped when he saw Hope's face. "Marcus, go get me a bag of ice from the freezer," Dorothy said. Her voice was calm, but her hands were moving fast, pulling the backpack off Hope's shoulder, setting the duffel bag on the floor, pushing the girl gently down onto the sofa. "Lily, baby, go to your room for a little while, okay? Miss Hope is not feeling well, and I need to help her." Lily obeyed without question. Marcus brought the ice. Dorothy wrapped it in a clean dish towel and held it against Hope's swollen cheek. The girl winced but did not cry. Her eyes were dry and flat, the eyes of someone who has passed through the far side of terror and come out into a place that is not calm, exactly, but numb. "He found out about the interview," Hope said. Her voice was toneless. "When I got home from the advocacy center, he was waiting. Mama was in the bedroom. She was not going to come out. She knew what was going to happen, and she was not going to come out. He hit me, twice, open hand. Then he said, 'You have brought this on yourself.' Then he told me to pack a bag and get out." Dorothy felt the room tilt. She pressed the ice gently against Hope's cheek and forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. In through the nose, out through the mouth. "He threw you out?" Dorothy asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "He said I was not his daughter anymore. He said I was dead to him. Mama heard everything. She did not come out of the bedroom. I heard the lock click. She locked the door." Dorothy's jaw clenched so tight she could hear her own teeth grinding. She set the ice down, pulled out her phone, the cell phone Althea had insisted she buy after the crisis began, and she dialed 911. She reported everything. A minor with visible injuries, thrown out of her home by her father, a case already under investigation by CPS and law enforcement. The dispatcher asked questions. Dorothy answered them. Her voice was steady, her hands were steady, but under her skin, a fury was building that she had never felt before in all her 60 years. A cold, clean, absolute fury that was not rage, but resolve. The police arrived in 11 minutes. 2 officers, a man and a woman. The female officer, whose name was Officer Denise Blake, took one look at Hope's face and her expression hardened. She photographed the injuries. She took Hope's statement. She called Claudia Freeman. She called the on-duty detective. Within an hour, Hope was officially in emergency protective custody, and Dorothy Mae Jenkins was designated as her temporary emergency placement. The female officer stood in Dorothy's living room, her hand on her radio, and looked at Dorothy with an expression that was professional but warm. "Mrs. Jenkins, you did the right thing, every step of the way. I want you to know that." "I know I did," Dorothy said, "but that does not make it feel any less like my life has been turned upside down and shaken." Officer Blake almost smiled. "No, ma'am, it does not. We will have a car drive by tonight, every hour. If anyone comes to this door who should not be here, you call us immediately." The officers left. Dorothy locked every door. She checked every window. She pulled the curtains closed. She made Hope a cup of chamomile tea, the same chamomile tea she drank on her worst nights, and she sat beside the girl on the sofa while Marcus and Lily peered from the hallway, wide-eyed and silent. "Come here," Dorothy said to her grandchildren. They came. They sat on the sofa, one on each side of Hope, and Lily, without being told, reached over and held Hope's hand. Hope looked at the small hand in hers, and something cracked in her face, the numbness breaking, the emotion flooding in, and she pressed her forehead against the little girl's hair and wept. Dorothy sat in the center of this tangle of children and held them all. She held them until the tea went cold, and the house went quiet, and the only sounds were breathing and the eternal hum of the refrigerator, and the distant sound of a police car making its first slow pass down Canker Street. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair by the front window, the one with the view of the street, and she watched the headlights pass and listened to the house breathe. She thought about everything. She thought about that first Tuesday when Hope appeared at her screen door. She thought about the collard greens in the sink and Mahalia Jackson on the radio. She thought about the bruises on a girl's arm that she could not unsee. She thought about standing in that sanctuary while 300 people stared at her and a woman in a white dress called her a Jezebel. She thought about Earl. She thought about what he would say, and she could hear his voice, clear as a bell, saying what he always said when things got hard. "The storm is big, Dot, but the God we serve is bigger. Keep your feet on the ground and your eyes on the sky." She looked up at the ceiling. "My feet are on the ground, Earl," she whispered. "They have never left." The arrest happened the following Friday. Dorothy heard about it from Althea, who heard about it from Deacon Washington, who heard about it from a police officer he knew. Gregory Caldwell was arrested at the parsonage at 6:45 in the morning, before dawn, before anyone in the neighborhood was awake. He was handcuffed in his bathrobe and placed in the back of an unmarked police car. The charges were multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor. The evidence included Hope's forensic interview, Gloria Hayes' corroborating statement, Dorothy's documentation, and, crucially, evidence recovered from Gregory's personal computer during a search conducted under a warrant issued by Judge Patricia Henley. Vanessa Caldwell was not arrested, but she was named as a person of interest in the investigation for possible failure to protect. When the officers arrived, she was standing in the kitchen of the parsonage, fully dressed, her makeup perfect, her purse on the counter as if she had been planning to leave. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not beg. She watched her husband being led away in handcuffs, and the only thing she said was, "I want to speak with my attorney." The news hit the community like a bomb. It was on the local television stations by noon. Prominent pastor arrested on child abuse charges. Church members who had been calling Dorothy a Jezebel and a liar 4 weeks earlier now sat in their living rooms, staring at their screens with their mouths open. The phone lines of Grace Eternal Baptist Church rang unanswered. The church website was taken down. The Sunday service was canceled for the first time in 14 years. Deacon James Washington called Dorothy at 2 in the afternoon. His voice was shaking. "Dorothy, I am so sorry. I am so sorry for what they put you through, for what we all put you through." Dorothy was sitting on the porch. The sun was warm. The screen door with the tear in it was propped open. Marcus was inside doing homework. Lily was playing in the yard with Hope, who had a butterfly bandage on her cheek and something in her eyes that Dorothy had not seen there before. Light. Not happiness, not yet, but the absence of darkness, the beginning of something new. "You do not need to apologize to me, James," Dorothy said. "You stood with me when it counted. That is what I will remember." "The church is in an uproar," James said. "People do not know what to think. Half of them are in shock. The other half are furious. Not at you, at themselves, for believing her, for turning their backs on you. Sister Henderson came up to me this morning crying, saying she saw Hope going to your house, and she told Vanessa, and she did not know. She just did not know." "She did not know because she was not meant to know," Dorothy said. "That is how these things work. The truth gets buried under so many layers of lies that even good people cannot see it. But it is there. It is always there." "What happens now?" James asked. "Now the law does its work, and the church figures out who it wants to be." The weeks that followed were a strange season, part nightmare, part awakening. Gregory Caldwell's arrest was the stone dropped into the pond, and the ripples spread in every direction. Other women came forward, women from the church and from a previous congregation where Gregory had served before coming to Grace Eternal. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its architecture. A young girl, a closed door, a secret, a silence enforced by power and position. The case grew from 1 victim to 5, and the prosecutor assigned to the case told Ruth Ann, who told Dorothy, that there might be more. Vanessa Caldwell hired a defense attorney and refused to cooperate with the investigation. She maintained publicly that her husband was innocent, that the accusations were a conspiracy led by Dorothy Jenkins and a disgruntled former member named Gloria Hayes. She maintained this position with the same unflappable composure she had brought to everything else in her life. The hat, the smile, the pearl-white Escalade, the image. But the image was crumbling. The congregation had seen the evidence. They had seen the news reports. They had seen the photographs of Hope's swollen face, which had been entered into the court record and were now public. The First Lady's performance was no longer convincing. 3 weeks after the arrest, the deacons called an emergency congregational meeting. Dorothy did not attend. She did not feel ready to walk back through those doors. But Althea went, and James went, and they reported back to her that evening. The meeting was chaos. 300 people in a room, all of them angry, all of them grieving, all of them trying to make sense of how the man they had trusted, the man who baptized their children and counseled their marriages and prayed over their sick, was the same man who had been hurting a child behind closed doors. Some people wept, some people shouted, some people sat in silence, their faces blank with the particular shock that comes from discovering that the foundation you built your life on was rotten. Deacon Washington stood up and spoke. He told the congregation what he knew. He told them about Dorothy's courage, about how she had taken a report from a terrified child and done everything right, every step, following the law, working with professionals, documenting everything, never seeking revenge, only seeking safety for a girl who had no one else. He told them about the campaign of retaliation that Vanessa and Gregory had waged against Dorothy. He told them about the unsigned note in the mailbox. He told them about Marcus coming home with a split lip. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear 300 people breathing. The kind of quiet where shame has a sound. Then Sister Florence Henderson, the neighbor who had told Vanessa about Hope's visits to Dorothy's house, stood up. She was a large woman with a voice that could fill any room, and she was crying so hard that her words came out in ragged bursts. "I am the one who told First Lady Caldwell that Hope was going to Dorothy's house. I thought I was being helpful. I thought I was looking out for the pastor's family. I did not know. God forgive me, I did not know. If I had known, I would have driven that child to Dorothy's house myself." The room broke open. People were crying. People were hugging. People were standing up to confess their own small cruelties, the whispers, the shunning, the note in the mailbox, the parents who told their children not to play with Marcus and Lily. It was ugly and messy and necessary, the kind of reckoning that a community goes through when it realizes it has been complicit in the very evil it claimed to oppose. Althea told Dorothy all of this, sitting at the kitchen table, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. Dorothy listened without speaking. When Althea finished, Dorothy looked at the photo of Earl on the refrigerator. The same photo, the same magnet, the same smile. "Earl always said that a church is not a building," Dorothy said quietly. "It is a family, and families have to tell the truth to survive, even when the truth is the ugliest thing in the room." Althea reached across the table and squeezed Dorothy's hand. "When are you coming back?" Dorothy was quiet for a long time. She looked at the kitchen, at the cracked lamp, at the curtains she had sewn herself 20 years ago, at the chipped mugs on the drain board. She looked at the screen door with the tears she had never patched. She looked at the worn path on the linoleum between the stove and the table, carved by 37 years of footsteps. "Not yet," she said. "Soon, but not yet. That girl needs me more than the church does right now." Hope was still living with Dorothy. The emergency placement had been extended by the court, and a more permanent arrangement was being worked out through family services. Hope slept in Marcus's room. Marcus had moved to a sleeping bag in the living room without complaint. The girl was seeing a therapist twice a week, a gentle woman named Dr. Price, who specialized in trauma, and who had told Dorothy, with careful professional understatement, that Hope was showing remarkable resilience for someone who had been through what she had been through. "Remarkable resilience," Dorothy had repeated. "Is that what you call it? Because from where I sit, it looks like a child who was forced to be strong before she was ready, and who found one person she could fall apart in front of." Dr. Price had smiled at that. "Mrs. Jenkins, you just described the most important factor in healing from trauma, a single, safe relationship. One person who believes you and stays. That is what the research shows. You are that person for Hope." Dorothy had nodded and said nothing, but later, alone in her kitchen, she had cried. Not from sadness, from the terrible, beautiful weight of being someone's one person, from the knowledge that she had almost not been. That if Hope had not walked up to her screen door on that Tuesday afternoon, if Dorothy had not been home, if the collard greens had been washed and Dorothy had gone to the store, if any of 1,000 tiny things had been different, that child would still be alone with her secret, and her father would still be standing behind the pulpit in his tailored suit, smiling. The trial was set for 5 months out. In the meantime, the evidence continued to build. The prosecutor was confident but cautious. Ruth Ann, who had maintained contact with her network throughout the process, told Dorothy that the case was strong, that the forensic evidence from Gregory's computer was damning, that the multiple witnesses created a pattern that was almost impossible to dismiss. But she also told Dorothy that anything could happen in a courtroom, and that Dorothy needed to be prepared for every outcome, including the one she did not want to imagine. Dorothy prepared. She prepared the way she had prepared for everything in her life, by doing the next right thing. She cooked meals, she helped with homework, she drove Hope to therapy appointments in the 20-year-old Buick with the broken air conditioning. She answered questions from the prosecutor's office. She gave a deposition that lasted 3 hours, during which she described everything that had happened from the first Tuesday afternoon to the night Hope appeared at her door with a swollen face. She spoke in her steady, even voice, and she did not cry. And the prosecutor told her afterward that she was the best witness he had ever seen. "You are calm, you are specific, and you are credible," the prosecutor said. "The jury is going to believe you." "They should," Dorothy said. "I am telling the truth." The weeks leading up to the trial were a strange limbo. Dorothy's life had settled into a new normal, a household of 4 instead of 3, a routine built around school schedules and therapy appointments, and the careful, slow process of healing. Hope was changing. The numbness that had defined her in those first terrible days was giving way to something softer. She laughed sometimes. She helped Lily with her homework. She and Marcus discovered a shared interest in astronomy, and Dorothy would find them on the back porch at night, looking at the stars through a pair of binoculars that James Washington had given Marcus for his birthday. But the fear was still there. Dorothy could see it. It surfaced in the way Hope flinched when a door opened unexpectedly, in the way she checked the locks before bed every night, twice, in the way she sometimes sat perfectly still in the middle of a conversation, her eyes going distant, her mind retreating to a place where Dorothy could not follow. "Give her time," Dr. Price told Dorothy. "Healing is not linear. She will have good days and bad days. The important thing is that she has them somewhere safe." The church, meanwhile, was rebuilding. Deacon Washington had been elected interim leader by a congregational vote, and he was doing his quiet, steady best to hold things together. He called Dorothy every week to update her. Some families had left, some new ones had arrived. The building committee was talking about renaming the church, which Dorothy thought was probably unnecessary, but understood the impulse. You cannot live in a house where something terrible happened without wanting to change the wallpaper. One Wednesday evening, about 2 weeks before the trial, Dorothy was sitting on the porch when a car pulled up to the curb. It was a newer car, clean and silver, and a woman Dorothy did not recognize got out of the driver's side and walked up the path. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, with the kind of careful posture that comes from years of professional life. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Dorothy with an expression that was equal parts nervousness and determination. "Mrs. Jenkins," the woman said, "my name is Patricia Caldwell. I am Gregory's sister. May I speak with you?" Dorothy's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. She looked at the woman, at the family resemblance in the jawline and the height, at the way her eyes were red-rimmed and tired, and she made a decision in the space of a single breath. "Come up and sit down," Dorothy said. "I will get you some water." Patricia sat in the other porch chair, the one that had been Earl's, and accepted the glass of water with both hands. She drank deeply, set the glass on the railing, and folded her hands in her lap. "I want you to know," Patricia said, "that I believe Hope. I believe every word, and I have believed it for a long time." Dorothy said nothing. She waited. "Gregory went through something very dark when he was young," Patricia continued, her voice low and strained. "It happened within our own family. We never spoke about it. Our mother knew more than she ever admitted, but she stayed silent. Our father had already left by then. Gregory carried that weight inside him for years, like something that slowly ate away at him. And I saw it. I saw how it changed him. Little by little, he became someone I didn't recognize anymore. I should have said something. I should have stepped in. But he was my brother, and I loved him. So I convinced myself I was mistaken, that what I was noticing wasn't real, that I was imagining things." "You were not wrong," Dorothy said quietly. "No, I was not wrong, and I have to live with that." Patricia pressed her lips together and looked out at the street. A car passed. A dog barked. The evening light was turning the houses on Canker Street gold. I came here because I want to testify. At the trial, I want to tell the jury what I know about my brother's history. I want to tell them about our uncle. I want to establish the pattern. The prosecutor told me it could help the case. Dorothy looked at this woman, this stranger who shared blood with the man who had hurt Hope, who had hurt Dorothy, who had hurt everyone around him for years. She looked at the courage it must have taken to drive to this house, to knock on this door, to sit in this chair and say these words.
That must have been a hard decision, Dorothy said. Patricia nodded. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. The hardest of my life. He is my brother. I love him. But love does not mean silence, not anymore. Dorothy reached across the space between the chairs and took Patricia's hand. It was the same gesture she had used with Hope, with Ruth Ann, with Althea, with Marcus and Lily. A hand extended across the distance between two human beings, bridging the gap between suffering and solidarity. Patricia's hand was cold. Dorothy held it until it warmed. "Thank you," Dorothy said, "for Hope and for the others." Patricia stayed for 20 minutes. They talked about small things, the weather, the neighborhood, the quality of the water in the town. They did not talk about Gregory again. When Patricia left, she paused at the bottom of the porch steps and looked back. "Mrs. Jenkins, there is something I need to tell you. Vanessa is not going to stand by Gregory much longer. I spoke to her last week. She is in survival mode. She is looking for a way out that preserves as much of her reputation as possible. When she finds it, she will turn on him. That is who she is." "I know who she is," Dorothy said. "I have known for 14 years. Patricia nodded once, got in her car, and drove away. Dorothy sat on the porch and watched the taillights disappear around the corner, and she thought about patterns. The pattern of abuse that ran through the Caldwell family like a fault line. The pattern of silence that had allowed it to continue. The pattern of courage that was finally breaking it. The trial began on a Monday in February. Dorothy was there. She sat in the third row of the courtroom, which was not the third pew of the church, but felt eerily similar. Beside her sat Althea Collins, Ruth Ann Carter, and Deacon James Washington. Behind her sat Gloria Hayes, who had driven 40 miles to be there, and Patricia Caldwell, who sat with her hands folded and her jaw tight. The courtroom was packed. Church members, community members, reporters, strangers, people who had come to see justice or spectacle or both. Gregory Caldwell sat at the defense table in a dark suit that was slightly too big for him. He had lost weight. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He did not look like the commanding presence who had ruled the pulpit of Grace Eternal Baptist Church. He looked like what he was, a man who had been caught. Vanessa was not in the courtroom. Patricia had been right. 3 weeks before the trial, Vanessa had filed for divorce and released a statement through her attorney expressing her shock and horror at the allegations against her husband. The statement was carefully worded. It contained no admission of knowledge. It contained no apology. It was the statement of a woman who was cutting her losses with surgical precision, salvaging what she could from the wreckage of the life she had built. Dorothy had read the statement in the newspaper and set it down on the kitchen table without comment. Althea had been less restrained. "That woman knew," Althea said flatly. She knew, and she chose to look the other way because looking the other way was easier than looking at the truth. And now she wants to act like a victim. I have never in my life seen such breathtaking gall. "Let it go," Dorothy said. "Vanessa Caldwell will have to live with what she did and did not do. That is punishment enough." The trial lasted 4 days. Dorothy testified on the second day. She sat in the witness chair and told the truth, the whole truth, in her steady, even voice. She described Hope coming to her door. She described the bruises. She described the weeks of visits, the careful documentation, the phone calls with Ruth Ann. She described the Sunday she was accused in front of the congregation. She described the shunning, the note in the mailbox, Marcus's split lip. She described the night Hope arrived at her door with a swollen face. She described all of it without flinching, without crying, without raising her voice. The defense attorney tried to discredit her. He suggested she had a personal grudge against the pastor. He suggested she was seeking attention. He suggested she had coached Hope.
He suggested she was motivated by financial gain. Dorothy looked at him the way she looked at people who tried to shortchange her at the register, with patient, implacable calm. "Sir," she said, "I am a 60-year-old woman on a fixed income who cleans houses for a living. I have nothing to gain from any of this except knowing that a child is safe. If you think I would put my family through what we have been through for attention or money, then you do not understand the first thing about who I am." The courtroom was quiet. The defense attorney moved on. Hope testified on the third day. Dorothy was not allowed in the courtroom during Hope's testimony because she was a witness in the case. But Althea was there, and she told Dorothy afterward, in the car, with tears streaming down her face, that Hope had been extraordinary. She had been clear, she had been specific, she had been brave beyond anything a 15-year-old should have to be. And when the defense attorney asked her why she had waited so long to tell someone, Hope had looked at him with those eyes that carried too much weight for a face so young, and she had said, "Because I was afraid nobody would believe me, and I was almost right." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Gregory Caldwell was found guilty on all counts. The judge set sentencing for the following month. In the courtroom, after the verdict was read, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then a sound, not a cheer, not a cry, but a collective exhale. The sound of 300 people releasing a breath they had been holding for months. Dorothy was in the hallway when Hope came out of the courtroom. The girl was pale and shaking, but her eyes were clear. She walked straight to Dorothy, and Dorothy opened her arms, and Hope walked into them the way she had walked into them that first Tuesday afternoon, with the desperate, grateful abandon of someone who has finally been believed. "It is over," Hope whispered against Dorothy's shoulder. "The trial is over," Dorothy said, "but your life is just beginning, and it is going to be so much better than what came before. I promise you that." They stood in the courthouse hallway, an old woman and a young girl, surrounded by the noise and movement of the justice system doing its imperfect, essential work. And Dorothy held Hope and thought about the screen door with the tear in it, the one she had never patched, the one that had let the girl walk through on a Tuesday afternoon and change both of their lives forever. Gregory Caldwell was sentenced to 25 years. He would be eligible for parole in 15. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, addressed him directly before pronouncing the sentence. She said that he had used his position of spiritual authority to prey on the most vulnerable members of his community. She said that the betrayal was not only of his victims, but of every person who had placed their trust in him. She said that the sentence reflected the severity and duration of the abuse and the calculated efforts to conceal it. Gregory stood at the defense table and said nothing. He did not apologize. He did not show remorse. He stared straight ahead with the expression of a man who still believed he had been wronged. And Dorothy, watching from the gallery, understood that he would carry that delusion with him to prison and perhaps to his grave. Some people cannot see their own evil. It lives in a room inside them with a locked door, and they have swallowed the key. Vanessa Caldwell moved to Atlanta the week after the sentencing. She did not say goodbye to anyone in the congregation. She did not reach out to Hope. She disappeared the way she had always made other women disappear, cleanly, completely, as if she had never existed. The parsonage stood empty. The pearl-white Escalade was gone. The only trace she left behind was a pair of reading glasses in the drawer of the bedside table, which the realtor found when showing the house to prospective renters. Hope stayed with Dorothy. The temporary placement became permanent through a guardianship arrangement that the court approved unanimously. Hope had her own room now, the room that had been Dorothy's sewing room, small and cluttered with fabric and patterns. Dorothy cleared it out in a single afternoon, painted the walls a soft blue at Hope's request, and hung curtains she sewed from fabric covered in small white stars. Hope chose the fabric herself, standing in the craft store with Lily, the two of them holding up bolts of cloth and comparing patterns with the seriousness of architects selecting materials for a cathedral. Dorothy went back to Grace Eternal on a Sunday in April. She wore the cream-colored dress, the one Earl had said made her look like an angel. She walked through the front doors holding Marcus and Lily by the hand, and Hope walked beside her, tall and quiet and steady. The sanctuary was different. The stained glass was the same. The pews were the same.
The cross above the pulpit was the same. But the people were different, softer, more careful, the way people are when they have been reminded of their own capacity for blindness and are trying, genuinely trying, to see more clearly. Deacon Washington was at the pulpit. He was not a preacher. He was a retired postal worker with a bad hip and a good heart. But he stood up there in his Sunday suit and his clip-on tie, and he spoke simply about the meaning of community, about how a church that cannot protect its children has failed its most basic purpose, about how the road back from failure begins with a single honest step. Then he looked at Dorothy, sitting in the third pew on the left, and he said, "I want to ask Sister Dorothy Mae Jenkins to stand." Dorothy looked at him. She looked at the congregation. She looked at Hope, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She stood.
"This woman," James said, his voice rough with emotion, "did what this church should have done. She listened to a child. She believed a child. She protected a child. She did it at the cost of her reputation, her friendships, her peace of mind, and very nearly her safety. She did it alone, or close enough to alone that the difference does not matter. And she did it because she is the kind of person who sees a stranger and decides to be kind. Not because it is easy, because it is right." The congregation began to clap. It started slowly, a few hands, then more, then everyone. The sound filled the sanctuary, rose to the rafters, bounced off the stained glass. It was not the polished, rhythmic clapping of a worship service. It was rough and urgent and real. The sound of people trying to say with their hands what they could not find words for. Dorothy stood in the third pew and let the sound wash over her. She did not smile. She did not cry. She looked at the cross above the pulpit, and she looked at Hope sitting beside her, and she looked at her grandchildren, and she thought about Earl, and she thought about the oak tree in the storm, and she thought about roots. Then she sat down, smoothed her cream-colored dress over her knees, and folded her hands in her lap. And the service continued. Months passed. The seasons turned. Autumn came to Canker Street with its particular magic. The smell of burning leaves and the sound of children running through piles of them. The shorter days and longer shadows. The way the light turned everything amber in the late afternoon. Dorothy's yellow house stood where it had always stood, leaning slightly to the left, the screen door still bearing its tier, the porch light still burning every evening. But things were different now. The house was fuller. Hope's laughter mixed with Lily's in the evenings, a sound that Dorothy had not known she needed until she heard it. Marcus was 13 now, taller, his voice starting to change, his drawings of rockets becoming more detailed and precise. He had joined the science club at school. He had stopped getting into fights. He had started writing in a journal, which he kept under his mattress and which Dorothy pretended not to know about. Hope was 16. She was in therapy. She was in school. She was, slowly, painstakingly, building a life on the other side of the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She still had nightmares. She still checked the locks. She still sometimes sat perfectly still in the middle of a conversation, her mind pulling her back to a place Dorothy could not follow. But the intervals between those moments were growing longer. The light in her eyes was growing steadier. She was, as Dr. Price had predicted, healing. Not linearly, not neatly, but truly. Gloria Hayes came to visit in October, driving her 40 miles in a car she had bought with her dental office salary. She sat on Dorothy's porch and drank sweet tea and told Dorothy about the support group she had started in her town for survivors of church abuse. 12 women so far, meeting every Thursday night in the back room of a community center. "You started something," Gloria told Dorothy. "You knocked down the first domino. And it is still falling, in ways neither of us could have predicted." Ruth Ann came too, bringing a pot of chili and 3 cats she was trying to rehome. Dorothy took one, a gray tabby with one ear, who immediately claimed the spot on the sofa next to Lily and refused to move. They named him Earl, which made Dorothy laugh so hard she had to wipe her eyes, and the cat seemed to approve of the name, purring with the steady, reliable hum of a well-maintained engine. Althea Collins had been elected to the new Church Leadership Council, the first woman to hold such a position at Grace Eternal. She was implementing changes with her characteristic blend of compassion and ferocity. Background checks for all volunteers. A child protection policy reviewed by a professional. Mandatory training for anyone working with young people. We will never be caught sleeping again, she told the congregation. Not on my watch. Deacon Washington continued to lead the church with his quiet, steady hand. He had no desire to be the permanent pastor. I am a postal worker, he told Dorothy. I deliver things. Right now, what this church needs delivered is honesty and humility. I can do that. A fancy sermon? Not so much. One evening in November, Dorothy sat on the porch as the sun went down. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and the last of the season's flowers. Hope was inside, helping Lily with a school project that involved glitter and glue and an alarming amount of both. Marcus was in the backyard with the binoculars James had given him, looking for Jupiter. The gray cat, Earl II, was asleep on the porch railing in a position that defied both gravity and common sense. Dorothy's phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize. She answered it anyway, because she had learned that sometimes the most important calls come from numbers you do not recognize. Mrs. Jenkins? The voice was young, female, hesitant. You do not know me. My name is Keisha Roberts. I am 17. I live in Greenwood, about 3 hours from you. I heard about what happened at your church. I heard about what you did. I found your number through the support group Gloria Hayes runs. I need to talk to someone. I need to tell someone what is happening to me. And I was told that you are the person to call. Dorothy sat very still. The sun was a thin line of gold on the horizon. The air was turning purple. Somewhere in the house, Lily shrieked with laughter, and Hope's voice said something soothing about glitter not belonging in hair. In the backyard, Marcus said, "Grandma, I can see Jupiter." Dorothy pressed the phone closer to her ear and leaned forward in her chair. "Keisha," she said, her voice steady and warm. The voice of a woman who has walked through fire and come out the other side carrying nothing but an open hand. "I am listening. You go ahead and talk. I am not going anywhere." The porch light hummed above her head. The screen door, with its tier, swayed gently in the evening breeze. It was the same door Hope had knocked on that Tuesday afternoon in September, the knock that changed everything. Dorothy had never patched the tier. She never would. It was not a flaw. It was an opening. It let the light in. It let the people in. It let the truth in, when it finally came knocking. And Dorothy Jenkins sat in her chair on her leaning porch, in front of her yellow house on Kinker Street, and she listened. The way she always had, the way she always would. With patience, with stillness, with the kind of attention that says, louder than any sermon from any pulpit, "You are safe here. You are heard. You matter." Marcus's voice drifted from the backyard, clear and full of wonder. "Grandma, Jupiter is so bright tonight." Dorothy smiled. She looked up at the sky, at the first stars appearing, at the vast, dark, shining expanse above the rooftops of her small street. "I see it, baby," she called back. "I see it." And for the first time in a very long time, the silence of the evening felt like something precious. Not empty, not frightening, not the silence of secrets kept, but the silence of a house full of people she loved, safe and whole and together, held in the quiet arms of a night that asked nothing of them except to rest. The coffee in her mug was cold. She drank it anyway. It did not taste bitter. It tasted like morning was coming, and morning tasted like beginning again. Thank you for staying until the final moment. If the story touched you, please support the channel with a like.